as President Obama reminded us a couple of years ago, we are the last generation who can take action to avert a climate catastrophe later this century that may cause the collapse of human civilization as we know it. And it warms my heart to see such a good response to this call in this turnout tonight. But when it comes to tangible threats to our lives, we're a risk-averse lot. We take out insurance on our homes to cover fire, flooding and burglary that may never occur. We fasten seatbelts in a car equipped with airbags and other safety devices that may never deploy. Our government spends millions of our dollars on military hardware, most of which will end up as junk without ever being deployed in the field of battle. But taking out insurance on climate change, the greatest threat to our collective existence, well, governments and prime ministers fall for failing to make the economic case to justify even a small cost to our budget. So tonight's discussion between our two eminent guests will hopefully help enlighten us all about the role of government and where ultimate responsibility lies. And to moderate the proceedings tonight, we're honoured to have Rob Gell AM. Rob? Rob is an environmental geoscientist, though better known to most of us for his 31 years as television weather presenter. He's a noted communicator on environmental issues and the science of climate change. He's a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, also a Life Ambassador for Australia Day, and in 2014 was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for his environmental work. Please welcome Rob to the podium.
Thank you, David, and may I add my welcome to our special guests and to the Mayor, whom I don't think I've had the pleasure of meeting, and all of you who are in the audience this evening. My role is to very quickly set the scene for tonight. David's begun that process. Then I'll introduce our speakers who will make short presentations. We'll have about 20 minutes of discussion facilitated by me with Simon and Tim. It will be a discussion, this is not a debate. Then we'll have about 20 minutes of questions from you on the floor, and then we'll give our speakers an opportunity just to wrap up briefly, make some concluding remarks. Then I'll wrap up, and all going well, we should be leaving the room by just after 9 a.m. As moderator for so 9 a.m. I wouldn't put you through that. Any of you. I should let you know that I've met Tim a few times. So I forget what the first time might have been. We've met before. But I have known Simon for many years, and we're friends, and I should even declare that I have a small shareholding in Hepburn Wind. So that's probably important as the discussion goes tonight. And Simon, of course, was the inaugural chair. Okay, so let me see if I can set the scene. There's our topic for discussion tonight. Just a really quick stuff about a bit of climate science. And I often talk about the Goldilocks principle. A little bit of CO2 in our atmosphere is responsible for life having evolved the way it has on this planet. And of course the physics was first postulated by Fourier back in about 1824. He's a mathematician, many of you will know him. And he postulated the greenhouse effect. John Tyndall proved the greenhouse effect in his lab, and indeed Svante Arrhenius in 1896 published in the Philosophical Magazine that if we double the amount he was working on the ice ages, he postulated if we double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're likely to increase the global mean temperature by 4 or 5 degrees. And this is a pretty frightening statistic. The amount of heat we're putting into the atmosphere because we've increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is the equivalent to generating about 400,000 Hiroshima explosions a day. This is one of the better ways of representing global mean temperature increases. There's another one that I like as well, but this is quite graphic for this evening's purposes. This has our plus 1.5 and plus 2 degree boundaries, the Paris targets. And you can see that as we get into the last decades of the last millennium, the outer rings spin out pretty quickly. So that's just from data. This is just some recent work, and I encourage you to have a look at it from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science for some very well-known Australians. Will Steffen's involved in this, Johan Rockström from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and a bit of a hero of mine, Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber from the Potsdam Institute, proposing the Anthropocene. And the same group's been talking about the Anthropocene rather than the last 10,000 years of relatively stable climate that's enabled our agrarian civilization to develop. They're talking about the need for a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, being the age of man. And they're talking about a range of different cycles. If I just go to the next slide, it doesn't come up too well in this slide, but there's our standard 100,000 year cycle of glacial interglacial in the loop at the bottom. You can see the current position of the Earth system, in fact a little bit warmer. I'd see pre-industrial temperature, the horizontal axis, our +2 target for Paris. Where we are now at A, or you can see where A is the mid-Holocene, 6,500 years ago. We're now at B. We really haven't been this warm for over 100,000 years, and the rate we're going, C and D are possibilities. And indeed, Stefan Rahmstorff just published last month with the very hot July we've had, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, and he makes the point that likely amongst the warmest months since the Eemian 120,000 years ago. And this is a lovely diagram which explains this sort of potential to go into an unstable state. So here we are, here's where we've come from. This is nice and stable over here in the glacial interglacial limit cycle. Here we are right now. We've got an opportunity to go here to a stabilised situation, and otherwise we might go into a hothouse Earth deeper into the Anthropocene that we might not be able to recover from. Lots and lots of events over this year in terms of a summer of extremes, from fires, heat and fires in North America, Europe and Scandinavia, wildfires in Sweden, Finland and Russia, deaths from extreme heat in Japan, melting glaciers in Europe, wildlife at risk, and nuclear plants unable to be cooled. This is another really good animation from Robert Rode, a lead scientist at Berkeley Earth at UCLA Berkeley. These are all records from this period of time. In fact, there's some black ones it's up here around Finland. I've actually got a photograph of, you will have seen it, a couple of reindeer sharing water at a lake in Finland, and the temperature about 30 degrees and a bushfire on the horizon. So we're breaking lots and lots of records. Just in terms of policy, and we are talking about policy, I love this slide, and I've actually verified this with Mr. Peacock, that in 1990 in opposition, his proposition as Liberal Party policy was for a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of at least 20% by the year 2000. If we go back and actually have a look, and I actually spent the time to do this, it's really it's a fascinating history, how we've responded to the science of climate change from the Villach Agreement back in 1987, but back in 72, the Stockholm Declaration, 76, we had the Australian Academy of Science looking at things. We picked up the Toronto targets, both Andrew Peacock and Bob Hawke did that. We had the Kyoto Protocol in 97. Chief Scientist Professor Robin Batterham wrote John Howard's Securing Australia's Energy Future white paper in 2004. In 2007, Peter Shergold, the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, reported on emissions trading, and John Howard asked, what's that doing there? And the Treasury Secretary, Ken Henry, in response said, Prime Minister, I'm taking as my starting point that during your Prime Ministership you will want to commit us to a cap on national emissions. In my view, if my view on that is wrong, there is really nothing more I can say. And Howard responded, yes, that's right. Henry continued, if you want a cap on emissions, then it stands to reason that you want the most cost-effective way of doing that. That brings us to emissions trading, unless you want a tax on carbon. And then at the end of this page here, we have Kevin Rudd signing the Kyoto Protocol, and then the most recent series, 2008 brought us the Garneau Reviews and the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, rejected by the Senate in 2009. Rudd dumped the emissions trading scheme in April 2010 and introduced a renewable energy target of 20% by 2020. In opposition, Tony Abbott put forward direct action and the Emissions Reduction Fund. Malcolm Turnbull referred to it as bullshit. Julia Gillard's Clean Energy Future followed in 2011. with her statement, "There will be no carbon tax under a government I lead, but let me be clear, I will be putting a price on carbon and I will move to an emissions trading scheme," which is the full quote, which is not often used. That was all repealed in 2013 by Tony Abbott. In 2016, Abbott and Julie Bishop set our post-2020 emissions reduction target at 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. Julie went to Paris and Malcolm Turnbull tried an emissions intensity scheme. Our chief scientist, Alan Finkel, an electrical engineer, reviewed the energy sector for Turnbull and suggested a clean energy target. It had bipartisan support, but it didn't see the light of day. Then Turnbull and Josh Frydenberg designed and redesigned a national energy guarantee, which was ultimately withdrawn, which leaves us to what our new group will do. This was published just 10 days ago by the Senate Environment and Communications Committee, so you sort of wonder where the balance might be. This is a paper on current and future impacts of climate change on housing, buildings and infrastructure. Amongst a range of good information and reasonable arguments based on the current science, it does identify in Chapter 2 the need for a strong mitigation response, and saying ultimately the best defence against rising costs and the physical impacts of climate change is to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and limit global warming to less than 2 degrees. The most recent Lowy poll describes that 59% of Australians say that global warming is a serious and pressing problem and that we should be taking steps now, even if this involves significant costs. Which brings us back to our topic and our first speaker. And may I introduce Tim. Tim Wilson has been the Federal Liberal member for Goldstein since 2016. He was formerly Australia's Human Rights Commissioner. He's a Bachelor of Arts, a Masters of Diplomacy and Trade from Monash, and a Graduate Certificate in Energy and Carbon Management from Murdoch University. He's worked in international aid and development across Southeast Asia as a consultant. He's run his own business. He's worked for radio stations and as a policy director at the Institute of Public Affairs. His principal areas of policy interest are health, trade, energy and the environment. Please welcome Tim to open up.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, and can I also begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and pay respect to their elders past and present. The short and sharp of it is that it is not straightforward to say, is the government doing enough to address carbon risk, because everybody will have their own opinions, and some people always think we need to go faster and slower, and anybody who's paid any attention to the events of the past week will know that this issue remains contentious. So what I'm basically going to do, because the reality is there's aspects of government's policy that's now very much evolving out of, shall we say, the shelving of the National Energy Guarantee, which included both mechanisms to deal with price reliability and cutting greenhouse gas emissions, and give you an overview of where we are, what we have done, and then as maybe as part of the discussion after Simon's spoken, to talk specifically about where we may go off the back of questions. So looking at the most recent data in terms of Australia's emissions trajectory, despite the fact that I'm sure it may not be completely satisfactory to some people, there has been some progress in terms of emissions profile, particularly the fact that only a few years ago, about a decade ago, we were talking about scenarios such as this. We're now sticking to a much lower level, and the potential with proper measures is to reduce it further in terms of overall emissions. The big challenge that Australia has always faced is its, of course, source of emissions, and as a consequence, how you can deal with different components of it depending on the policy framework that we implement. What we know is, of course, electricity is the primary base of our emissions profile. Then we have direct combustion around other industrial processes, as well as other different types of activities. Now, it's easy to say that we want to close those loops and reduce the emissions profile from some of those sectors. But in order to do so, we need to have technologies to change to, or from what we're using now, and to different options. And so, for instance, in the space of land use and land clearing, the key focus, which I'll talk about shortly, of things like the Emissions Reduction Fund, has actually been to find ways to reduce the emissions profile of that sector. Now, I'm not putting all of this down to the ERF, but there have been measures that have been taken, and will continue to do so. We do have areas of policy that still have some challenges also around agriculture, and particularly around the source and profile of those emissions, and how it is we're going to seek to see a reduction over not just obviously the trajectory of the commitment of the Paris Agreement of 26 to 28% by of 2005 levels, but beyond that, should there be a requirement to do so. The ERF was a policy framework that was introduced, and I know Simon will go on and talk about how it was defunded and whatnot, but it is actually a measure that was set up by the government primarily to make sure that there were different ways of focusing on reducing emissions, which wasn't simply off the back of the CPRS/emissions trading scheme/carbon tax. Obviously, the issues around emissions reduction and particularly energy and energy prices remains a very serious one for the Australian community. Rob showed before some data around the attitude of Australians to wanting to cut emissions, including if there was a cost, and it's certainly true that people do want to cut emissions. But there is, when you look at other sets of data, it shows that the degree to which they're prepared to pay for it varies quite considerably. And so part of the focus of the ERF was to say, what can the government essentially auction off as a pathway to get people to come up with innovative ideas to reduce the emissions profile in different sectors, and you can see them over there on the left-hand side in terms of the number of tonnes that have been reduced through the ERF and its efficacy as a measure. The question is whether things like the ERF have more potential and more to offer a country like Australia over the period, both of the Paris period and also the post-Paris period, as a way of working particularly with some of those sectors that have not traditionally been at the fore of public debate and sometimes harness the potential of communities to be effective. And so one of the ones that's regularly held up as a poster child is programs around savanna burning in the northern parts of the country, which act as both a benefit in terms of reducing emissions, but concurrently also provides a pathway for employment and opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to deal with their environmental management with different parts of the country. And so the scheme...
Sorry, you referred to the stuff on the left-hand side. I don't know whether it's my eyesight.
Oh, right. So I can't perfectly see it from this angle, and I apologise, but it goes through different issues around vegetation, landfill and waste management, agriculture. The next one, Simon, can you read it out? Savanna burning, energy efficiency, industrial initiatives and transport emissions reduction. So the point is that it wasn't supposed to be a one-size-fits-all, let's just target energy, as a lot of the policy focus has been in the past. It's to say, where can we find gains and opportunities in other sectors of the economy and our country, particularly when you can see the potential for innovation, and that might be through soil sequestration of carbon and the like. And so there have been 7 auction periods, which I'm talking about on the right-hand side here, that have gone through the different prices that abatement has essentially been secured, and the average auction cost is $11.97. So in terms of per tonne of abatement, which is actually quite cost effective really. I mean, there are obviously other ways you can achieve different ones depending on different industries and different sectors, but it's proven to be very effective as a mechanism and maybe something we need to return to. We've also had the National Energy Productivity Plan, which is focused on improving dramatically energy efficiency in different parts of the economy, and that goes from consumer behaviour and making sure that you can make informed decisions to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions in the consumption of the goods and services that you buy, and try and inform as many consumers as possible. There's been other efforts that are being made in the federal parliament of people that I'm working with around improving national energy productivity as well, because the opportunities from reducing the emissions profile from productivity is quite substantial. Many years ago I remember a story that was in the Economist newspaper where it looked at a company called Frito-Lay's, which if anybody likes potato chips may like or be familiar with. And Frito-Lay's used to buy its potatoes based on weight. And so what a lot of the producers of potatoes would do is they would pump them full of water to, of course, increase their weight, which then meant they had to be dried out, which, of course, consumed a lot of energy. And, of course, nobody was gaining and when there was a lot of waste, but it was all being driven by the objective of price. Once they did sensible carbon auditing, they discovered this anomaly, that it was completely unnecessary and that if they just paid potato farmers a little bit more, that in the end they'd actually get a cheaper overall cost, but by chance it also happened to reduce their emissions profile. So there are always things that individuals can do, there are also always things that businesses can do, but the potential improvement from the National Energy Productivity Plan is not unreasonable in terms of its efficacy as a measure as well. And then of course we have the CEFC, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and the many programs that it's sought to fund, and I don't know whether you can read this or not. I'm sorry, I think it might just be the consequence of the quality of the slide, I apologise. But looking at different measures, whether it's investment measures or direct clean energy investment, to try and to finance avenues to reduce emissions profile, whether it's through things like the expansion of direct measures to households, and of course a shift towards transportable emissions as well. All of this information, by the way, is completely publicly available. There's a report that's been produced by the Department of Energy and Environment looking specifically at the government's different climate policies. But the big one, and the one that always draws a lot of attention, is of course the discussion around electricity. And as I said, if you ever want to see an example of the debates around electricity, you only need to look at the past week. You only need to go through the examples and the slides that Rob Gell went through before, during 2009 and beyond, around the carbon pollution reduction scheme, which Kevin Rudd ultimately shelved. And that this remains an incredibly tense area of public policy, and yes, it's on my side of politics, but one of the things that people misunderstand is it's also on other sides of politics as well. Because in the end, consumers are sensitive, prices of electricity, and there are multiple components that go into the price of electricity bills, is something that consistently comes up in terms of Australians' concern. And one of the things that the recent Finkel review did, and I think quite helpful, is provide this graph, which is to look at the practical reality of the cost profile of different electricity generation. And what it means for a country like ours, particularly in terms of dealing with the transition that we have and the challenge that we have as a nation in going from what is principally an energy market built on supercritical black and brown coal, and then the alternatives and over time. And one of the things that the National Energy Guarantee was designed to achieve was a policy framework to manage what one of the last conversations I had with our former Prime Minister, the next 10 years. Because I'm a great believer that technology over time, as costs go down, and this is, for instance, the cost of solar thermal, which you can see dramatic reductions in levelised cost over time, or large-scale solar over time, will help us manage that issue around cost. But until we get to that point, we have to set up a policy framework which makes sure that we have affordable power pumped into the market, while also dealing with the challenges of emissions and also reliability. And the issue around emissions, and particularly around carbon risk, is very serious because, of course, nobody makes investments in new energy for a period of 5 years. They do it for much longer time frames. In fact, most of them look at their returns over a 15-year time cycle. So hence, thinking not just about the price today, but about the price and where it'll be in 15 years, and the influence that government policy can be quite dramatic in informing those investment decisions. So this is just a graph to go through the base of where our energy comes from, and as you can see, black coal, brown coal, then you go up to gas, then hydro, which is a larger share, increasing share, and if we get Snowy 2.0 up as a component, we might see more use of hydroelectricity as well. And then on top of that, solar and wind, of course. So each one is quite important, each is quite significant, particularly because when it comes down to household bills and what people pay over time, there is no singular component. Some of the biggest increases, of course, we know are in network charges. Those have largely been imposed through consequences of state government decisions, and those decisions have largely been made. But there has been a significant increase as a consequence of the increase in price of wholesale electricity, as well as environmental costs. That's not to argue against it, it's just to be an honest and accurate assessment of the challenge that we face. And if you look at the state of Victoria, the large-scale renewable energy target factors in 49% of the environmental costs. This came from the recent report done by the ACCC. The small-scale renewable energy, which is basically solar PV cells on people's homes, 16%, state government policy 14%, and the feed-in tariffs from solar PV cells is about 21%. And of course, one of the biggest areas of concern, particularly for South Australia, is the dramatic increase in the cost of their residential bills. Now that will be different for wholesale, but it has a big impact on the commercial viability of a lot of businesses in South Australia that are energy intensive. And that would be dollars per year, yes. Dollars per customer, I should say. So per year, yeah. And these costs are real. I mean, Victoria and South Australia, particularly Victoria, have had traditionally very energy intensive economies, and the impacts go through to productivity, competitiveness, and of course, ultimately, the number of people who are employed. I know there's a difference between wholesale price and the residential retail price, but those costs also come through to some of the wholesale consumption as well. So the task and the challenge we face is very real, to make sure that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions while also making sure we have reliable energy and also mean that we can afford it. No singular measure is going to get us there, least because we know that consumers will continue to be sensitive and that there is a limit to the elasticity or the preparedness for individual consumers to shoulder the cost of reducing emissions. That's not an argument to do nothing. It's to look at the multitude of strategies we are going to need to reduce emissions while delivering that outcome. That is where the government's focus has been. One of that has, of course, been the National Energy Guarantee. As I said, that has been shelved. The new Energy Minister has outlined today that he is interested in focusing on what he can do to deal with those issues around energy affordability. The government has also separated out energy and the environment. I personally think that's a very good thing, because I think it set up this very difficult conversation that every time we were talking about energy policy and emissions, that it led to a discussion around how prices needed to be higher. And I'm sure Simon will go through some of the practical realities of what's actually happening in some areas of technology and energy technology and the competitive options that are available to us in the future. So it is something that is considered and understood and being taken care of, but we do have a way to go. Thank you.
That's why we're quickly loading up Simon's slides. Simon Holmes is our second speaker. Simon began his career as a software engineer in Silicon Valley during the first dot-com wave. Shortly after returning to Australia in 2001, he built and sold Observant, a precision farm water management company. He helped establish the Australian Community Energy Movement as founding chair of Hepburn Wind, the country's first community-owned wind farm. Simon was the founding chair of the Melbourne Energy Institute Advisory Board and is the director of the Climate and Energy College at Melbourne University. Simon writes and speaks regularly about all aspects of Australia's energy transition. Please welcome Simon.
Great thing. Don't have a shift key anymore. How's that? Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along tonight, and thank you for the opportunity to address on this really important topic. Does government policy adequately address climate risk? This is a slide I often show people who ask whether Australia should be doing anything. We're such a, I think the word was used on Sky News this week was we're a pissant country when it comes to emissions. I often want to point out to people that there's sorry, move this up. Great. I often point out to people that if we line up all the emitters in the world, there's a bunch which I'm calling the under 2% club. Right at the top of the under 2% club is Australia. There's about 190 jurisdictions in there. We're right at the top of that. And together, we emit about as much as China and the USA. Now, if we have a look at the trends over the last, 30 years, amazingly, the US has started to decarbonise. And that's a mixture of renewable energy and cheap gas. We see that China, this purple line, has increased and started to level off in line with their commitments under the Paris Accord. We see India is increasing, and that's a worry, but there's a bunch of policies that they've implemented that are starting to turn that around. But the most worrying trend is this rest of the world, and we are right up there in the rest of the world. So when folks say that really all the action is in China and India, no, the real worry is this rest of the world category, and we're at the lead of that. I want to talk quickly about Australia in a carbon-constrained world. It's very clear that this discussion around reducing emissions extends far beyond our borders. In fact, every country in the world ratified the Paris Climate Agreement. We'll talk about the US in a second. We are one of the wealthiest countries who are a signatory of it. We've had 27 years of unbroken economic growth. We have very strong institutions. We have a stable political environment, right? But we have strong legal and financial institutions. Internationally, companies like doing business in Australia. In a low-carbon world, we have a comparative advantage. I once heard Australia talked about as the Disneyland of energy. We've got it all. We've got wind. We've got the best wind in the world. We've got the best solar in the world. We've got the best wave. We've got some half-decent geothermal. We've got, yes, we do have heaps of coal and gas, but as we move into a world where we are going to have trouble exporting that energy, and we're going to have trouble being a global actor by burning that resource, luckily, we are blessed with an amazing natural resource, natural low-carbon resources. We also have an opportunity to export these in a low-carbon world. Well, we already export energy in the form of aluminium. Aluminium is congealed energy. At the moment, we're producing it largely with coal. We will be smelting more and more minerals and processing more and more minerals with renewable energy as we go forward, as we've seen with South Australia and Sanjeev Gupta's GFG Alliance. There's even a proposal to run a cable from the Pilbara region, the East Pilbara, into Indonesia to export 3 gigawatts of wind and solar power. Remarkably, with advancements in the technology of both generation and subsea distribution of electricity, it looks like towards the end of next decade it will make sense to export power in subsea cables from Australia. But one of the reasons why we really want the rest of the world to start decarbonising is that we are more susceptible than any other continent to climate change. Our farmers at the moment, as we know, are experiencing quite a very severe drought, 100% of New South Wales, and 3 weeks before the end of winter, we started fighting bushfires in New South Wales. I think Sunday before last, I had a look on the app, and there were 60 uncontrolled bushfires. This is about 6 weeks past midwinter. Here's a quote I found the other day: "We have every resource available to meet the challenge of climate change except for one, and that is leadership." Sadly, I guess he didn't really take his own advice until the very last moment, and we saw how that worked out. In 2015, as I mentioned before, the world came together and decided that they were going to do something about this with the Paris Climate Accord. It took a while to get everyone to sign on to it, but eventually every country, I think the last countries were Nicaragua and Syria were the last to sign on. Disappointingly, the US, under the Trump administration, withdrew, notified their intention to withdraw. Now, that doesn't take effect. If they do continue to go ahead with it, ironically, it's going to, it will come into effect, their withdrawal, on the day after the next US presidential election. So that'll be an interesting election issue for people to discuss. That aside, a bipartisan coalition of 17 US states have said that they are going to uphold the Paris commitment, and more than 120 American Fortune 500 companies have signed on to pledges to go 100% renewable over the next decade. So, as I showed you before, the US, even though the Trump administration has pulled out, they are decarbonising and doing so more successfully than Australia. So how are we doing? I've got the same chart as Tim, which is good. We both read the same government reports. I added a dotted line on here, which is from the government's own numbers, where we need to end up if we're to meet the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, we need to be about 415 megatons of carbon by 2030, and this is the trajectory that we're on. So by the government's own numbers, the policy settings are inadequate. So that's the topic of tonight. Clearly, we are, as things are set, we are not going to make it. In fact, we are increasing our annual rate of emissions by 0.5% a year, whereas to meet that, we need to reduce it by about 1.3%. Where have the emissions come from over the last decade? Stationary energy, so that's mainly industrial usage of heat, transport, mainly ground transportation, is a huge, and that's set to grow quite significantly. Fugitive emissions, that's largely from gas and coal extraction, the gas and coal that leak while we are extracting and processing that resource. And then small amounts from increases from agriculture, industry. Very minor reduction we've achieved from the waste industry, and a very significant reduction we've received in the electricity market. So although electricity's done really well for us, it's been wiped out. You know, all of these other gains are undoing all the good work that's happening. A great stat I heard the other day that there's the Gorgon LNG gas project up in the northwest shelf had a requirement to capture the CO2 from part of its stream. It's 2 years late in doing so, and that 2-year delay has wiped out the carbon reduction from everyone's solar panels in the country. So just that delay from one project is that significant. I just want to, there's a lot of lines going on here, but this is one of my favourite graphs. It's updated every month or so by Hugh Sadler, and it shows the change in usage of our different fuel sources. So you can see, starting around 2008, we started using less and less coal, and it jumped down significantly during the carbon price. We finished the carbon price, and bang, it starts increasing. Brown coal, this is the end of Hazelwood, this bit here, but we see a movement away from it, but the biggest movement away was again during the carbon price period. Slow and steady, we've got rooftop solar, this red line. So although it feels like it's, you know, every additional system's a very small increment, there are so many. There's 1.84, I think, last time I checked, 1.84 million households in Australia that have put solar on, and together it is just behind wind as the largest growth in energy through the last, well, since 2008, through the last decade. What's that done to emissions? Well, I just marked in here the carbon price period. So we saw a fall there. As soon as the carbon price came away, our emissions went up. And then this reduction here is from the renewables that have come into the system since, really, I guess, since the industry stopped the investment freeze at the end of Abbott's Warburton review. This is where the government currently thinks the trajectory will go. There are a lot of people a lot more optimistic than that. Just want to show this chart here is where the electricity emissions are expected to go by folks who have looked into it a little bit more deeply. This actually is the Energy Security Board's estimate of emissions under the NEG. So as you can see, the NEG, which was to take effect in 2022, was going to do exactly nothing to emissions. So that's why the Coalition Party room blew itself to pieces, was over that line being too ambitious. As we're looking at this dotted line here, this is Labor's line, the 45% emissions reduction in the energy in the electricity sector by 2030. Yeah, it's kind of, you know, it's down, it's in the right direction. This, interestingly, this darker blue line is what AEMO, the energy market operator, says is business as usual. So the fight between the coalition well, I guess some people wanted, Craig Kelly actually said he wanted to increase emissions. He wanted to have, he wanted to incentivise people to increase their emissions. No, sorry, that was Christensen. George Christensen said that. So we've got, between doing nothing, between doing 45%, this is what the Business Council of Australia says would be a wrecking ball to the economy, this target, but AEMO, the market operator, says that's business as usual anyway. The green line is where the Climate Change Authority says we've got to go if we're going to meet the Paris Agreement of well below 2 degrees. So it's kind of funny that we're having such a wild debate about how reckless this target is when it's business as usual, when this is actually the target that we should be trying to work out how to hit. I just want a quick rundown of the policies. It's been touched on by Rob. We had the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, which was killed by Tony Abbott in 2009. We had the RET, which everyone had expected would be extended, but unfortunately because of Tony Abbott, it's not going to be extended past 2020. Somebody killed the carbon price. Anyone remember who? In 2014. Direct action was a program put in place by Greg Hunt under Abbott. It has been defunded. Tim warned that I would say that. It had an original grant of $2.25 billion. It hasn't had any money given to it in the last 3, maybe 4 budgets. And it's a deeply compromised scheme. There's some nice architecture in there from a policy perspective, but I'll give you an example. There's a company that has produced, that has applied to the ERF and been funded many times to cap the gas at landfill sites, run them through a generator, generate electricity, and then be paid under the ERF to do so because it's less carbon emissions going, or less methane going into the environment. The issue is, though, that under the landfill's planning requirement, they had to do it by law anyway. So they're being paid by the ERF to fulfil a requirement. The company, so they're dipping there. They're generating power, so it's nice. They get some revenue there. It's classified as renewable energy, so they're getting paid there. And the crazy thing is, all these plants were built before the ERF was even done. So there's no additionality with that project, and I could give you a list of a whole bunch of other projects that would have gone ahead anyway, but are being funded under the ERF. The emissions intensity scheme was taken off the table at the beginning of the Finkel review. The clean energy target was taken off at the end of the Finkel review, and after that we rolled into the Energy Security Board's National Energy Guarantee, and as you all know, that was killed very recently. In fact, I saw on Tuesday, I noticed that it was exactly a fortnight since Josh Frydenberg had come out of the party room and said there's overwhelming party support for the National Energy Guarantee, and it's now only up to the states to make it happen. And that was, that's 16 days ago. Where to from here? Well, here's a quote. This was in my morning news, a note from the Daily Telegraph. Daily Telegraph understands the emissions reduction will play no future role in energy policy. Asked directly if he'll keep an emissions reduction target, Mr. Taylor said his only focus was lowering power bills and improving reliability. I hope in question time we'll get a chat to talk about lowering power bills, because there are no silver bullets for that, and anyone who's promising you to do is, is not telling the truth. And anyone who's telling you they're going to improve reliability has to first front up to the real truth that we have an incredibly reliable power system. We have met the reliability standard in Australia every year this decade in every region, yes, in South Australia as well. And AEMO's modelling is that we're going to meet the reliability standard every year for the next 10 years in every region as well. We don't have a reliability problem. We could guarantee, we could move from our 99.998% reliability system into a higher level of reliability, but that would cost us billions. And at a time when we're talking about lowering power bills, we can't pretend that we're going to do anything to improve reliability without adding massive amounts of additional expense onto people's bills. And that is the end of my presentation.